They said she was too broken to be worth anything. A woman whose limp was the first thing folks noticed, whose quiet eyes carried more winters than smiles. At the Dusty County auction, people snickered when the bidding started at $2 less than the price of a sack of flour. No one saw her as a wife, a worker, or even a neighbor. Just another burden to pass along. But one man stepped forward, a poor rancher with calloused hands and an empty table, and laid his coins down. Everyone thought he'd lost his mind. Some whispered he only wanted someone to cook and clean. Others said pity had blinded him. The girl said nothing, only tightened her shawl against the wind and followed him home. What the town didn't know was this: the limp had a story, and the story had teeth. She'd walked through more danger than most men could bear, and she'd learned that love, if it came at all, often wore the plain face of kindness. Then came the night when shadows moved at the edge of the barn, when a single gunshot cracked the air, and the rancher's life hung in the balance. It was then the limping girl stepped forward, swift, steady, and with a courage that silenced every laugh that had followed her. They had judged her by the way she walked. They never imagined how far she'd go to protect the only man who'd ever stood still for her. So what happened next after the shot rang out, after the truth came spilling into the lantern? Light changed not just their lives, but the way the whole town measured worth. Would you stay to hear how a $2 gamble turned into the kind of love that never limps? The auction yard smelled of dust and old rope, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. Folks gathered not for cattle or horses that day, but for something far more unsettling: people. A handful of women thin from travel, some clutching worn satchels, stood in a crooked line near the edge of the pen. Their eyes rarely met anyone's. At the far end stood Ellaner Price. 50 years had put silver at her temples and carved quiet lines along her face. She leaned on a carved walking stick, her limp noticeable even when she stood still. Years ago, a wagon wheel had crushed her ankle, and though it healed, it never healed right. She wore a plain calico dress and a knitted shawl, one sleeve carefully mended 3 times over. She did not fidget or bow her head. Her heart, however, was not so steady. She'd been here before, not the same place, but the same shame. When her husband died, her brother-in-law took the farm, saying she was too slow to keep it up. Since then, she had been passed from cousin to cousin, each offering a bed for a while, each growing tired of her presence. This was the last stop before the poorhouse. The auctioneer's voice cracked in the dry air. $2 for the limping one. She can still cook, sew, and tend a garden. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Men nudged each other, making jokes she pretended not to hear. Her fingers tightened on the cane knuckles, pale. She had learned to survive humiliation by swallowing it whole. Then from the back, a voice: $2. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the laughter. Heads turned. A tall man in a weathered hat stepped forward. His coat was patched, his boots scuffed from long rides. His eyes gray as the winter sky fixed on Ellaner, not with pity, but with something steadier, like recognition. Sold, the auctioneer barked, half smiling at the absurdity. The man handed over the coins, took her small bag from her, and said only, "Name's Samuel Carter." "Let's go." Ellaner followed him through the murmurs, each step slow and deliberate. She didn't ask why he'd bought her. She'd learned long ago that asking too much could make a place temporary. The wagon ride was silent, but not heavy. Samuel's hands stayed on the reins, his posture unbothered by her presence. The road wound through bare cottonwoods, past open pasture where cattle grazed. Finally, they reached a modest ranch, fenced but worn. The barn doors hung slightly crooked. Smoke trailed from the chimney. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. "You'll have your own room," he said, simply pointing to a small space off the kitchen. "I could use help here, but I ain't expecting miracles. Just be comfortable." Comfortable. The word landed strangely like a stone in water. She had been useful, tolerated, endured, but comfortable. That was something she wasn't sure she remembered how to be. That night, Ellaner lay in the narrow bed, staring at the low ceiling. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. In the quiet, she realized the knot in her chest wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was hope. He had paid only $2 for her, but in his silence there was no cruelty, no mockery, only room she didn't know how to fill. Was this the start of belonging, or just another stop before the world moved her along again? Morning on the Carter ranch began with the slow creak of the windmill and the lowing of cattle in the distance. Ellaner rose before the sun more from habit than instruction and found Samuel already in the kitchen. He stood by the stove frying eggs in an old cast-iron skillet, moving with the easy precision of a man who'd long been alone. "You cook?" he asked without looking up. "A bit," she replied, unsure if it was a job interview or small talk. "Then you can take over tomorrow. My eggs taste like leather." He slid a plate toward her, half a smile twitching at the corner of his mouth, before he disappeared out the door to feed the livestock. Eleanor ate in the quiet, the sound of the wind outside almost louder than her own chewing. This place was different. No sharp orders, no muttered complaints about her limp, no relatives measuring her worth in chores done. Still, she kept her guard high. Years of being the burden had taught her that kindness often came with an expiration date. By mid-morning, she ventured outside. The land stretched wide, rolling into the horizon, the kind of openness that could make a person feel both free and small at the same time. Samuel was repairing a fence, his coat hanging from a post, shirt sleeves rolled up. He worked without hurry, each movement deliberate. She noticed a small graveyard on a hill beyond the barn, 3 simple wooden crosses weathered gray by wind and sun. She didn't ask, but Samuel caught her looking. "My wife." "2 sons," he said, voice low but steady. "Winter fever, 87. Ellaner swallowed hard, the weight of his loss pressing into the space between them. "I'm sorry," she said. "Life's cruel that way," he replied, hammering a nail into the post. "Takes what it wants, leaves the rest of us figuring out what to do next." In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm. She cooked meals that made the small kitchen smell like home stew, with fresh biscuits, coffee strong enough to wake the bones. Samuel, in return, made sure the path from the house to the barn was swept clear of rocks so she wouldn't trip. They didn't speak much, but the silences were easy. One evening after supper, he brought out a deck of cards. "Ever play?" "A long time ago," she admitted. They played until the oil lamp burned low, her laughter surprising even herself when she won a hand. Samuel looked at her then, not as the limping girl from the auction, but as someone who belonged in the light of his kitchen. That night, lying in bed, Ellaner thought of how strange it was to feel seen without being judged. It was a rare kind of seeing, the sort that noticed the person before the flaw. She'd come to the ranch as a transaction, a trade sealed with 2 silver coins. But in the quiet evenings, with the smell of wood smoke and coffee in the air, something unspoken was taking root. Was it friendship, or the slow start of something neither dared name? The spring storms came early that year, sweeping across the plains with a fury that rattled windows and soaked the earth in icy rain. Ellaner stood at the kitchen sink, watching Samuel wrestle a tarp over the haystack. His shoulders hunched against the wind, his hat pulled low. He looked like a man built to endure storms, both the kind that fell from the sky and the kind life threw at you. But inside Eleanor's chest, another storm was brewing. She had grown comfortable here, too comfortable maybe. The Carter Ranch had become a place where she could breathe without waiting for the next insult, where her limp wasn't a punchline and her worth wasn't measured in what she could bear or give. But comfort was dangerous. It made you forget the lessons hard years had carved into your bones. Nothing good lasted, and kindness often came with a bill you couldn't pay. That night over supper, Samuel asked her something that made the fork pause halfway to her mouth. "Why were you at the auction, Ellaner?" Her first instinct was to lie, say she needed work or had no family. But lies were heavy, and she was already carrying enough. "My brother's wife said I was eating more than I earned. I was slowing them down. They sold me for the price of a cow." Samuel didn't flinch, didn't pity her. He just said, "Their loss," and kept eating. That should have been the end of it. But the question opened a door inside her she'd been trying to keep shut. Nights came when she'd wake from dreams of the old house, her brother's voice sharp in her ears, reminding her of every flaw, every failure. She'd lie in the dark, afraid Samuel might one day see her as they did. One evening after a particularly long day, Samuel came in muddy and tired. Ellaner served supper, but before either of them sat down, he asked, "You ever think about leaving?" She froze. Was he offering her a way out or warning her that her time here was almost up? "I've thought about it," she admitted softly. "I've also thought about staying." Their eyes met across the table, and for a long moment neither looked away. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, hope, tangled with fear, warmth tempered by the memory of loss. Samuel finally nodded. Sometimes staying's the harder choice. That night, Ellaner lay awake staring at the ceiling. She knew she was standing on the edge of something that could change her life. But stepping forward meant trusting that Samuel wouldn't turn out like the rest. And trust was the one thing she'd never learned to give easily. She'd survived years of being unwanted, yet here was a man who seemed to want her without asking for more than she could give. But was his steadiness real, or just another kindness waiting to vanish? The rain turned to sleet overnight, and by morning, the whole ranch looked dipped in glass. Ellaner had never seen the land so silent, the fields frozen, the creek still, even the horses huddled together, with their breath curling like smoke in the cold. Samuel had gone into town for supplies, leaving her with the chores. She didn't mind. The rhythm of work kept her thoughts from drifting into places she didn't want to go. But by mid-morning, she heard the sound of hooves, two riders coming up the path. They weren't friendly. Two men's faces, half hidden under hats, stopped at the gate. The taller one called out, "We're looking for a woman named of Ellaner Wade." Her stomach clenched. She hadn't been Ellaner Wade in years, not since the day her brother sold her off. But hearing her name in that voice, sharp and accusing, made every scar on her heart ache. "What do you want?" she asked from the porch, gripping the railing to steady her bad leg. The other man spat into the snow. "Your brother says you took something from him. Says you owe him." She almost laughed. Took something he'd taken years from her: dignity, health, things she could never get back. But men like her brother never saw it that way. The riders didn't leave quietly. "We'll be back," the tall one said before turning his horse toward the road. When Samuel returned and found her pale and shaking, he didn't ask questions right away. He simply took the bucket from her hands, set it down, and said, "Tell me." And she did. For the first time, she told someone the whole of it: how her brother's debts made him cruel, how he'd humiliated her for years before trading her like a worn-out saddle, how she'd come here with nothing but a limp, a bundle of clothes, and the hope that maybe this time she'd land somewhere safe. When she finished, Samuel's jaw was tight. "They won't touch you here," he said. "Not while I'm standing." The warmth of his words wrapped around her, but in the quiet that followed, her old fear whispered, "What if he's only saying that because it's easy now? What happens when it's hard?" That night she sat by the fire long after Samuel went to bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Part of her wanted to pack and leave before trouble came. Another part wanted to stay and see if this man truly meant what he'd said. The hardest part was knowing. Whichever choice she made would change everything. Her past had found her doorstep, threatening the fragile peace she'd built. Would she run before it all fell apart, or risk believing that someone might finally stand beside her, no matter what came? The next 2 days felt like living inside a ticking clock. Every creak of the barn door, every far-off hoofbeat made Ellaner's heart jolt. She went about her chores, but her eyes kept drifting to the horizon, scanning for riders. Samuel noticed. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man to fill silence just to make it easier, but he stayed close. When he went to chop wood, he told her where he'd be. When he fed the stock, he made sure the rifle was leaning by the back door. It was the kind of watchfulness that wasn't loud or showy, but it settled something deep inside her. On the third afternoon, the riders returned. No smiles this time. They came right up to the porch, their horses stamping in the snow. "We told you," the tall one said, dismounting. "Your brother wants what's his. You come now, or we take payment another way." His eyes flicked toward the barn. Samuel stepped out before Ellaner could speak. He didn't raise his voice, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "She's not going anywhere. And if you think you can come on to my land and threaten her, you'd best think again." The short one smirked. "You gonna fight us both, old man?" Samuel took one step forward. "If I have to." For a moment, Ellaner thought the men might push it. She could feel the air tight and smell the sharp tang of leather and horse sweat. Then maybe because of the way Samuel didn't flinch, or maybe because winter cold makes fools think clearer, they spat, swung back into their saddles, and rode off. Her knees nearly gave way when they were gone. Samuel caught her by the elbow, steadying her. "You're safe," he said again, softer this time. But later, alone in the kitchen, Ellaner's hands shook as she kneaded bread. Safe. She wanted to believe it. But safety wasn't something she'd known in decades. It was a word people said before the world proved them wrong. Yet when she brought the bread to the table that night, Samuel smiled in that quiet, grateful way of his. And she felt something unexpected. Maybe safety wasn't a place or a promise. Maybe it was a person. For the first time in years, someone had stood between her and the storm. But could she trust that he wouldn't walk away when the skies cleared? The morning after the riders left, Ellaner woke before the first blush of dawn. The house was still the fire, only embers in the stove. She pulled Samuel's coat over her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit at her skin, but the quiet wrapped around her like a heavy quilt. For years, she'd carried the weight of other people's choices, her father's cruelty, her brother's greed, the men in town who saw her size as something to mock rather than the shape of a life lived in survival. She had learned to shrink herself in spirit if not in body, so she wouldn't give them more reason to wound her. But Samuel had stood between her and danger without hesitation, not because she begged him, not because she'd earned it, but because, in his eyes, she was worth it. That realization loosened something inside her. She didn't even know was locked. When he came out with 2 mugs of coffee, his breath visible in the icy air, he handed her one without a word. They stood together watching the sun push over the hills, the light spilling across the snow. "I've been thinking," she said finally, her voice almost lost in the wind. "All my life I've been trying to make myself small. It's never worked, and I don't want it to anymore." Samuel glanced at her, a slow smile forming. "Good. The world needs you exactly as you are." It wasn't a grand declaration, no passionate speeches or vows. But to Ellaner it was more freeing than anything she'd ever heard. She felt the years of shame and fear begin to fall away, not all at once, but like ice melting under a steady sun. When she went back inside, she noticed something different. Her steps were lighter. Her voice when she spoke was steadier. And for the first time, she looked at the home they shared and thought, "I belong here." She had finally stepped out from the shadows of her past, but would the world let her keep the light she'd found? Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, the snow retreating in patches to reveal stubborn grass beneath. Ellaner noticed it one morning as she hung laundry on the line, the first green she'd seen in months. The town had begun to change toward her, too, though not overnight. At first, people only nodded politely when they saw her beside Samuel in the mercantile. But over time, small gestures followed Mrs. Henley sent her a jar of preserves. Young Peter from the feed store offered to carry her flour sack. The school teacher asked if she'd bring one of her pies for the spring social. Ellaner didn't need their approval to know her worth anymore, but each kindness felt like another brick removed from the wall between her and the world. On the day of the social, Samuel waited for her at the wagon dressed in his best shirt. She carried a pie still warm from the oven, the scent of cinnamon curling into the crisp air. When they arrived, Samuel's daughter Clara ran to meet them. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around Ellaner's waist and said, "I saved you a seat next to me." It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. Later that evening, as lanterns lit the gathering and fiddles played under the stars, Samuel took Ellaner's hand. "You've changed more than this ranch, Ellaner," he said quietly. "You've changed me. You've changed all of us." Ellaner looked around the warmth of the lantern light, the laughter spilling into the night, Clara leaning against her arm, and she realized this was more than survival. This was living. Her past had been filled with locked doors and cold silences, but here she had found something worth staying for, a home, a family and a man who saw her as more than enough. And in that moment, Ellaner knew the truth. Love had come late, but it had come to stay. From the ashes of a life she thought was over, she had built something new. But what happens when life tests that fragile piece? In the months that followed, the laughter that once trailed behind her faded into quiet respect. Folks no longer saw the limping girl, but a woman whose courage had kept a man alive, whose heart had turned a lonely ranch into a home. The rancher often said that $2 was the best money he'd ever spent, not because he had bought her, but because it was the price of the moment their lives turned toward each other. Love didn't arrive for them with flowers or fine words. It came in the shape of shared chores, quiet suppers, and the steady knowing that neither would have to face the cold alone again. Sometimes life gives us people who don't fit the world's idea of beauty or strength, but who fit perfectly into the space we didn't even know was empty. And sometimes the greatest treasures arrive looking nothing like what we expected. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this: never measure someone's worth by what they seem to lack. Measure it by the love they have to give. Thank you for riding along on this Wild West journey. If you'd like to hear more stories like this of unlikely beginnings, Second chances and quiet love that lasts? Please subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, share this video, and leave a comment below. Do you want to see what happened after the rancher and the limping girl built their life together? Or hear another tale of love found where no one was looking? I'd love to know.